When Jesus was arrested, the shocking truth behind that moment. The highway at 2 in the morning looked like a river of black glass, rain stitching the asphalt with silver. Eduardo Martínez sat hunched under the glow of the cruiser's dashboard, the heater doing little to stop the chill that lived in the bones of his shoulders. His hands were rough from years of duty, from nights like this when the city folded in on itself and only the highway lights kept pretending there was order. He had been on these roads for longer than he wanted to count. He thought he had seen everything. He thought he had learned how to hold what hurt without letting it leak into his life. But there was a place inside him where the memory of one night, one taut, terrible 5 minutes, had lodged like a splinter. Roberto Sanchez's voice, the flash of muzzle fire, the sickening way time slowed while a partner bled out in his arms. He replayed it in short loops. The radio call that came too late, the decision to take the left instead of the right. The 5 minutes he rewound in his mind and found fault with again and again. Guilt was a small, persistent animal in him, eating at sleep, at patience with Carmen, at the distance from Miguel. It had hardened into a habit. He drove with that hardness tonight. The radio murmured, garbled transmissions, and the familiar static lullaby of the night shift. His reflection in the windshield looked older than his ID. Rain hit the glass in long, urgent fingers. He checked the rear view, then the shoulder. A patch of white moved at the edge of the road. At first he thought it was a tarp caught by the wind. Then he saw skin, pale, bare, stepping through puddles. He pulled over, lights cutting through the rain, the cruiser's siren a soft, almost apologetic wail, and watched the figure slow and turn. The man wore a tunic that clung to him in the downpour, white but not pristine. The hem scraped the wet gravel. He walked barefoot. His feet were streaked with mud. It was not an ordinary call. Eduardo's training folded over him, approach with caution, while some other part of him, frayed and raw, tightened like a fist. He clipped his radio, stepped out into the cold, and felt the rain seep through the collar of his jacket. The man did not look startled. He walked slowly, as if he had time to spare. When he stopped, he tilted his head toward Eduardo and smiled without malice, without calculation. The smile was simple, as if he recognized a tired friend and was glad to see him. "Evening," Eduardo said, voice steadier than he felt. The man's eyes were the color of old light, soft, direct, and not at all afraid. "Good evening," the man answered. His voice had a shape like small stones smoothed by water, precise, low, patient. He introduced himself as though naming someone he had known for a long while. He would give no address. He offered no identification. He said he had been walking home. "Why are you out here barefoot in this weather?" Eduardo asked, the question coming out more as protocol than curiosity. "Because there is no hurry," the man answered, "because the road will take care of me." A cop's instinct surged. This was vagrant behavior, could be intoxication, could be a disturbance waiting to happen. Eduardo radioed in a stop. He checked the man for weapons. The tunic was thin, water-saturated. No cuffs on the wrists, no bag, no contraband. The only thing the man carried was a kind of calm that made the rain sound louder. Eduardo felt something unnameable loosen for a moment at the edges of his guilt, an opening he couldn't afford to trust. He opted for the standard course: detain, transport, process. He read the man his rights in the automatic cadences that police training carved into your mouth. The man did not object. He allowed Eduardo to slip the cuffs on his wrists with no sudden moves. He walked to the back of the cruiser with a grace that made Eduardo, despite himself, think of a priest in an empty church. The drive to the station was a blur of wipers and radio chatter and the throb of his own pulse. The man sat quietly behind the safety partition, hands cuffed at the front now by Eduardo's decision. Once, the man hummed something. It held a melody like a lullaby from a language Eduardo had only ever heard in churches during holidays. Eduardo tried, unsuccessfully, to place it.
At the booking desk, Sargento Morales peered up from his paperwork and raised an eyebrow. Captain Herrera arrived 10 minutes later with that look he carried, a face used to measuring liabilities and outcomes. "Another one?" Herrera asked. The captain's voice was a thin wire that always made conversations tilt toward paperwork and statements and reports. Eduardo handed over an incident card that read, "Pedestrian detained for questioning. No ID located. Subject non-resistant." Morales ran a check that came back clean. No warrants, no past arrests. The security cameras hadn't picked up anything remarkable other than the silhouette on the shoulder and Eduardo's cruiser rolling over wet tar. "You checked him for drugs?" Morales asked, not unkindly. It was the question one always asked, the question meant to re-anchor the scene in the world of explanations. Eduardo wanted to say he had checked the man with his whole life, not just his hands. He wanted to confess that the man's gaze had pried at something behind his ribs. Instead, he said, breath steady, pulse normal, walked on his own. They led the man in through fluorescent corridors that smelled of institutional soap and the faint iron tang that seemed to cling to all police stations. The lights hummed in a color that stole warmth from faces. The interrogation room door thudded shut. The room was small. The table was metal. 2 chairs faced each other. An observation mirror stared like a black eye.
Eduardo had imagined many interrogations, some mundane, some ugly, but he had never before wrestled with the feeling of being watched from the inside of his own chest. He set the man in the chair. The handcuffs clicked against the metal. "Name?" he asked, again as much for procedure as curiosity. The man looked at him as if trying the sound of his life in Eduardo's mouth. "They call me many things," he said. "Tonight, you may call me a traveler." There was a pause, the kind that collects the air in a room and compresses it. Eduardo tried to keep the conversation on the rails. What were the man's intentions? Where had he been? Had he been a danger to himself or others? The man answered questions not by information, but by invitation. He spoke about burdens, about the way people carry things that do not belong to them. "Some people carry rocks," he said. "Some people carry letters they never read. Some wear coats that are too heavy. You must know which belong to you." The words brushed against Eduardo like cold water. He felt the shape of the 5 minutes, how he had been the one to step into the small void where courage had been needed and felt himself shrink away. And the words the man spoke did not condemn him. They looked at him, they named the ache, but did not point a finger at him with accusation. Instead, they named with the gentleness of someone who had watched a man carry a burden and understood how it got there. Captain Herrera kept one foot propped against the wall outside the glass, arms folded. "You took him for a welfare check?" he asked eventually, skeptical. "Why not take him to a shelter?" "We don't have one open at this hour," Morales said. "Besides, he could be a risk, could be dangerous." The man smiled, which seemed to flatten the edges of Herrera's worry. "Danger is sometimes a name given to what the world fails to understand," he said. "Sometimes danger is a cloak put on someone who is carrying other people's harm." Eduardo's throat tightened. He tried to steady his voice and failed. "Are you intoxicated? Do you have a mental health issue?" "No," the man said simply. "Only a heart that remembers what it has been shown." "Do you have a place to stay?" Morales pressed. The practical, small questions everyone asked to make reality feel sensible. "For a time," the man said. "But tonight I was walking to a place where I felt something had to change." Eduardo thought of Carmen's half-closed eyes those mornings when he left for the night shift. The way she had recently learned to meet him at the door with a distance that felt like a statement. He thought of Miguel's silence at breakfast. He felt in a raw and immediate way how the small fissures of his life had widened into canyons. The man in the tunic was not asking for permission to enter his life. He was standing at the threshold and inviting him to step back in. Yet Eduardo was not a man to step easily into metaphors. He had a ledger in his head, calls answered, Crimes prevented, patrol hours logged. He was trained to document, to make sense of chaos in columns and checkboxes. The man's stillness felt like a risk to that ledger. It made the space behind Eduardo's sternum ache. He did the paperwork. He recorded statements that were precise and flat. He made the detainment report. He watched the man, who rarely looked at the ceiling, instead at Eduardo's hands, at the division in his face, at something that had been left unresolved. "Tell me one concrete thing," Eduardo said finally. "Why were you there on the highway? What were you waiting for?" The man's gaze became a steady thing. He said, "I was waiting for someone to stop, someone who carried too much." He tapped the table with a fingertip. "And you stopped." There was a softness in the room now, a dangerous, necessary softness that made the fluorescent light less clinical and more like a spotlight on a confession. Eduardo did what men trained to hold themselves together sometimes do. He laughed softly, the sound losing itself in the empty corners of the room because it was both shock and defense. "I stopped because it's my job," he said. "Officer Martinez, I don't know you. You don't belong here." "You belong where you are," the man said, "but you do not belong to the guilt that follows you." The words were small. They were precise. They landed with a force like a stone dropped into a quiet pool. Eduardo felt the air rush out of his lungs. He knew then, with a clarity that saved him from lying, that this man knew things men on the street could not have known. How he knew them was not a matter for his professional ledger. It was a fissure in the city's street map, a place where rational explanations might not travel easily. "Name one thing," Eduardo demanded, feeling his hand go to the drawer in his desk where a pistol sat, an anchor in times when his certainty needed proof. "Name one thing that proves you were who you claim to be." The man's smile narrowed into the shape of a question, and answered it with the quiet of someone speaking to a man out at sea. "I will not speak for the name they might call me. I will tell you what I see. A man carrying 5 minutes that do not belong to him." Even saying the words in the air felt dangerous. 5 minutes. The exact span of time that had looped in Eduardo's nightmares. He had counted them like beads. They had been the hours between a shout and the siren arriving, the time that separated action from consequence. He had blamed them, and in blaming himself, he had built a cell around his life. To hear another voice name that precise measurement was to hear a verdict and a remedy in the same breath. Eduardo felt something shift. And do not mistake the word. I'm not suggesting he dissolved into revelation. He remained a man who carried a badge, a man whose hands were used to taking evidence, not metaphors. But the muscles around his eyes loosened. He felt, for perhaps the first time in a long time, that the thing he had been holding might not be insoluble. "Don't try to tell me what to feel," he snapped, more to reassure himself than to rebuke the man. "You weren't there. You don't know the sound." "You remember the sound," the man said. "You remember the color of Roberto's jacket. You remember the exact words your partner said to you before he fell." The name landed, Roberto, like a bell. Eduardo felt the world harden, then thin. He had never given his partner's name out on a whim. He had not spoken it aloud in years, beyond the names carved in his memory at night. No one in that room knew what lay behind his hands, the way his fingers sometimes trembled when he thought of that night. The man's knowledge was specific enough to be unbearable. Eduardo's breath shortened. The fluorescent light buzzed in a way he suddenly felt in the marrow of his body. He found himself looking at the man's feet, dirty, small, real, afraid that if he looked at his face he would fall. "Tell me what else you know," Eduardo whispered, because he could not help himself. The words came out of him like a surrender. The man's voice slid into the space between them. "You wake in the night at 3:17. You keep a pistol in the top drawer of the nightstand." For a moment there was only the rhythm of rain against the window and the faint hum of something distant. Eduardo's lips parted. He felt the old animal fear, the defensive posture of a man who has lost control, rise. The man did not speak with triumph. He spoke with the solemnity of someone reading a list of grievances at a funeral. "How?" Eduardo started, but the rest of the question was swallowed. He found himself reaching for an answer that would unhook the sensation of being seen so completely. The training language would have been to question, to search for confabulation, to call a psychiatrist, to note the subject's apparent knowledge as possibly coached. But the man had no air of someone rehearsed. He had the quiet, steady patience of someone who had spent a long time listening. "Why would you know that?" Eduardo asked again, less an officer's inquiry than a cracked-open man's plea. The man looked at him directly. "Because no one should have to sleep on the ledge of their life, afraid to drop the burden laid across their chest," he said. "Because sometimes the only way a heart begins to move is when another hand meets it and says, 'This will not be yours to carry alone.'" Morales shifted in the doorway. Herrera cleared his throat. The raw, private parts of the conversation were mucilage between the practical concerns of the station. Eduardo could feel duty pulling him one direction and the unfamiliar ache of being understood pulling him another. "You're saying I can lay it down?" Eduardo's voice trembled like a bell struck too hard. "I'm saying you can choose," the man said. "Choice is a door. You can open it, or you can keep the wall." There were many answers a man in Eduardo's position knew he could offer: legal, protocol, psychological. But his throat had tightened in a way that felt less about rules and more about a confession waiting to be birthed. The room seemed to narrow around the image of Roberto's jacket, around the rekindled memory of the siren that had come too late. "Yes," Eduardo said finally, and the word felt at once like a small rebellion and a prayer. He did not know what it meant to say yes to a stranger in a tunic. He did not know whether he was surrendering to an impulse or to something deeper. The man reached toward the table and, with hands that looked like they had held things for a long time, tools, loaves, perhaps nothing of the sort, he slid across a small folded piece of paper. It looked ordinary, the brown of a notebook torn out, ink that had bled slightly in the rain. Eduardo hesitated, the officer in him thinking of contamination, chain of custody, evidence. The man's eyes met his with a curious warmth. "Keep it," he said. "When you are ready to read what it tells you, do so with those who love you." Eduardo picked the paper up with a glove of duty and human impulse both. He held it to the light. The handwriting inside was slanted, neither rushed nor elaborate. There were one or two phrases that, when he squinted at them in the hum of the fluorescent light, made his chest feel both smaller and larger at once. He felt the first surprising thread of a thing that had not been present for a long time: permission. Captain Herrera cleared his throat again. "We should process it," he said, the default position of a man more comfortable with paperwork than with mysterious notes. The man in the chair let out a sound like a small laugh and said, "Process what you must, but do not let your process be the only thing that defines you." Morales scribbled a note. Cameras hummed. The station's old clock clicked toward morning. Outside, the rain washed crosswalks clean of whatever secrets had dried there earlier in the night. The man sat still, wet fabric clinging to his knees like a second skin, and waited with a patience that felt both human and other. Eduardo folded the note back into his palm and felt the papery scrape of the fold. It was an object with weight. It meant someone had taken time to make a mark, to offer something less than an answer and more than a riddle. He tucked it into his uniform pocket on top of the badge, over the place his heart pushed against his chest. "Do we know where he came from?" Morales asked. "No," Eduardo answered. His voice sounded small in the room. "He was on the shoulder of the road when I found him." The man said nothing more. He sat as if tired and yet invincible in his smallness. Something about him made the fluorescent light feel less like interrogation and more like a frame for a painting someone could not quite name.
Eduardo found himself thinking of parables he had half remembered from childhood, stories told by men who stood in courtyards and spoke in images. He didn't know why those images came to him now, only that they did. There was, always in such moments, the option to lean into the known. Arrest him, file the paperwork, chalk him up to the city's nightly flow of people who had slipped through the grid. There was, alternately, the option to step across a line he had kept himself wary of for years. It was a small hinge between life as ledger and life as possibility. Eduardo sat back in the chair, and the fluorescent light made the small room feel like a stage. He looked at the man, who had his hands placed calmly on the table. Mauricio, the man, smiled again with the kind of softness that was not pity but recognition. For the first time in a long time, Eduardo allowed himself to breathe in a way that did not taste like ash. "Before we go any further," he said, voice finding purchase, "why didn't you resist? You could have walked away when I approached." "Because I was not lost," the man answered. "I was sent." The word landed like thunder in a room of quiet. Sent. Eduardo had heard entire homilies about vocation and call and providence, things people said in parishes and at kitchen tables to make meaning of the unmeaningable. To hear it now, in a tiled interrogation room with rain on the windows, felt both improbable and incandescent. "Sent by who?" Morales asked, trying to find the tangibility in theological language. The man smiled, and it was like a lantern lit slowly. "By whoever tends to the hurting," he said. "By the hand that insists on mercy, even when the ledger keeps telling us otherwise." Eduardo thought of Roberto, of Miguel, of Carmen's jaw when she tightened against him in the mornings, of the ways the city kept score and buried the scores in men's sleep. He thought, too, of all the nights of patrol where he had seen small mercies performed and then ignored, gestures of humanity that slipped through the fingers of law and became stories only in the hearts of the people who had been touched. The station clock clicked. Somewhere down the corridor, a radio fell into a static lull and then found voice again. The rain kept keeping time on the roof. Eduardo felt the strange swaddle of dread and relief. He sat forward, the chair creaking, and put his elbows on the table. "If you were sent," he said slowly, "then who do the others think you are?" The man looked out, as if seeing beyond the mirrored glass. "Some will say I am a prophet. Some will say I am a madman. Some will say I am an angel. Some will say I am a trick. Some will not look at all. They will decide until the decision fits their story." Outside, a phone began to ring in a neighbor's kitchen. Inside, the man in the tunic lifted his hands and, after a moment, spoke a phrase Eduardo would later hear repeated in the mouths of neighbors, in the timid testimony of children returned from the edge of trouble, in the hush of a church under jacaranda trees. "See with the eyes of the heart." It was not a command, it was an offering. Eduardo felt, like a man returning a borrowed item he'd kept too long, the lift of a weight, subtle, not sudden, but undeniable. He reached into his pocket, fingers closing around the damp paper. He thought of Roberto's grave and the names etched there that did not help him sleep. He thought of Miguel's small face at the kitchen table, homework abandoned, eyes distant. He could have processed the man, thumbed through the bureaucratic motions that turned mystery into paperwork. He could have told himself he would do the right thing by procedure and keep the distance there was between him and anything that might ask for a change. He could have continued to carry 5 minutes like a stone cuffed to his chest. Instead, he kept his hand on the folded scrap of paper until it warmed. After the first block, if this kind of true-to-life story stirs you, consider subscribing for more modern tales of grace. Captain Herrera continued to hold the ledger open in his head, and the room hummed with the soft noises of people doing official things. But something in Eduardo had opened up, like a valve easing pressure. He was not converted in that instant. He was not turned into an evangelist or a zealot. He was a man who had been seen in a way that made it impossible for him to continue pretending everything was in its right place. They moved the man to a holding cell with cinder-block walls that smelled faintly of old coffee. The light there was colder still. Eduardo walked back toward the interrogation room, his boots sloshing on the linoleum. He felt the paper in his pocket like a pact. As he passed the observation mirror, he paused and looked at his own reflection, the badge, the crease of stress beside his eyes, the line where sleep had abandoned him. For a moment he allowed himself to imagine another life. Mornings where he kissed Carmen as she stirred without caution. Evenings where Miguel told him about school projects without avoidance. Nights where the radio was background noise and not a summons for what might go wrong. Back at the desk, they took a breath and prepared to do the work that always came next. Statements, forms, logs that would make sense of an otherwise inexplicable event. Eduardo sat down and found that his hands were steady. He could lie to a form. He could check the boxes and dispatch the narrative of the night into the file labeled odd, no charges probable. He could hand the man in the tunic over to a morning shift and call it done. But he did not. The interrogation room had a second chair, and the one he occupied now felt like a place to listen. He opened a folder and then closed it, realizing the world was moving in a way that challenged the categories he used to protect himself. He sauntered to the observation window and watched the man in the holding cell, seated on a narrow bench, his bare feet tucked beneath him, fabric dark with rain. The man did not pace or mutter. He looked unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. "Who are you?" Eduardo asked again, not demanding now, but searching. The question was more for himself than for the man. The man met his gaze and answered, "I am someone who knows what burdens look like in the dark." At that moment the intercom crackled, and a voice that belonged to the city itself, Doña Socorro Garcia's, unmistakable with its mixture of concern and urgency, blew into the station through a phone call to Captain Herrera. The elderly woman's voice was thin but sure. She said in a tremulous, fast Spanish that carried the taste of neighborhood gossip and something deeper, "Eduardo, it's Doña Socorro. I don't know why I'm calling you at this hour. My neighbor's boy, Diego, he knocked on my door this afternoon, and he said a man in white sat with him for a while near the plaza. He gave him a chocolate and told him to go home. I don't—" her voice cracked. "It was strange. He said he felt lighter." The words opened into the room like a window. Eduardo felt them as both confirmation and complication. Strange visitors and the city's quiet miracles had a way of moving in pairs. One neighborhood testimony, one odd note in a police blotter. Sometimes they ended there. Sometimes they moved like a contagion into the lives of people who had nothing to do with the initial incident. "Did you tell him to come here?" Eduardo asked, voice almost hopeful. Doña Socorro sniffed, embarrassed. "No, mijo. He only sat and then walked away. But he told Diego to watch his little sister. He told him to tell his mother that she was brave." Herrera rubbed his chin. Another civilian interaction? Same description? The details were not identical, but no one promised they would be. What clustered at the center of each account was a pattern. A man in white, a calm that made people reluctant to be frightened. Small acts of presence that repaired tiny things. Whatever the explanation, the story was starting to be larger than the station. Eduardo folded his hands and felt the paper heavier. He did not know what he would do with the man after duty ended and paperwork insisted upon itself. The pragmatic part of him drew up charts in his head, logs, probable outcomes, the likely headline in the morning paper. The other part, a part increasingly larger than he liked admitting, wanted to follow whatever this was to its end. He wanted to see how many lives could be pried open with a soft sentence, a steady gaze, an offered note. He left the man in the holding cell and stepped out into the rain again. The air smelled like onions and wet pavement, and the beginning of a dawn that would come sooner than any of them expected. He walked without much plan, boots beating a staccato on the sidewalk. And when he thought of home, of Carmen's turned back in bed,
of Miguel's unfinished homework, he felt his hands go to his pocket and close around the paper like a talisman. By the time he reached the cruiser, his mind had a new, precarious map. A note, a man who knew too much, a city that would either shrug or wake. He had the sensation that a hinge had been turned somewhere in the fabric of his life. He had no language for it yet that did not look like a chink in police procedure. When he sat behind the wheel, he noticed the rain had eased into a mist. The highway looked less like a river now and more like a long ribbon that could carry you somewhere. He turned the key and the engine growled to life. For the first time in a long time, he did not feel the weight inside his chest as an immutable law. He felt it instead as something that might be negotiable. He started the log on his dashcam, not because he trusted the camera to confess his internal weather, but because the city always asked for records. He keyed in the code for an unscheduled detention and then left a blank line where the explanation might be, if an explanation ever came. He drove toward home with the note in his pocket and the knowledge that the man in the white tunic had slipped the first key into a lock he did not know how to open. He did not know if the key belonged to him, to the city, to God, or to something else entirely. He only knew the key turned, and that was enough to make him both afraid and strangely hopeful. The road tasted like possibility and threat at once. As the cruiser sliced through the rising fog, he could not imagine that the night's small, sharp events would be contained to that hour. He had the sensation, faint at first, then growing, that arrests do not always mean cages. Sometimes an arrest could be the beginning of release. And as the city began to wake in a gray wash under the jacaranda trees, something like a question took root in his chest, small and stubborn. If a man like that could be stopped on the shoulder of a highway, what else might the night allow him to see? He drove the last stretch home with the city thinning out around him, jacaranda silhouettes against the dawn like ragged hymns. The note in his pocket had warmed to his thigh. He kept his fingers there as if the paper might steady him. He pulled up to the house and hesitated, boots cold from the rain and waiting, and for a moment the cruiser's engine felt like the only steady heartbeat he owned. He told himself he would walk in, set the note on the kitchen table, and go to bed as if nothing had happened. He told himself all the things men tell themselves to keep their private storms from spilling. Carmen opened the door before he could raise his hand to the bell. Her face was rimmed in sleep and worry. The distance between them was a geography he had been avoiding, small gestures that accumulated into a canyon. The dishes left in the sink, the way their conversations had become transactions, the quiet the house swallowed like wind. Miguel was at the table, eyes rimmed with fatigue, drawing or doodling while a cereal bowl went cold between his fingers. He looked up when Eduardo came in, careful as a boy approaching a sleeping dog. Eduardo stood in the threshold with the note folded heavy in his palm. The light in the kitchen was old and soft, the kind of light that let flaws be seen without making them cruel. Carmen's jaw tightened when she saw him. For a breath he saw all the things he had not done for them, the birthday he had missed, the football games he had called in from the lot, the nights he had answered calls instead of coming to bed. For the first time in years he felt the shame of that absence, not as a weapon but as a map, one that pointed to a way back. "You're late," Carmen said simply. She had learned to keep statements small so they wouldn't explode. "I was on patrol," he answered, the old line. He could have folded it into the safe structures of work and duty, but the note had already broken the surface of his life in a way that made falsehoods taste thin. He sat slowly at the table where Miguel had been drawing. The boy's hair stuck up in an unruly crown. He looked so like Roberto in the jaw and in the set of his mouth, small echoes that made a man keep his hands quiet. Eduardo reached into his pocket and set the paper between them like a truce. "It's nothing," he said, then corrected himself. "It's something." Carmen watched the way his fingers trembled around the edge, as if the tremor could be evidence. "What happened?" she asked.
Her voice held fear that had nothing to do with danger in the streets and everything to do with change. He told them the truth he could afford, the basics of the night, the man on the shoulder, his walk into custody, the way the man had spoken. He did not pretend he understood everything. He did not tell them what he did not want them to think, that some part of him had believed too easily in a miracle. He told them instead about being seen, about a weight in his chest having been named, about the paper and the words on it that had the steady bluntness of something urgent and kind. Carmen read the note over his shoulder. The script was simple and deliberate. When she reached the line that said, "Go home, forgive, live," her mouth made a small, involuntary sound, half laugh, half sob. Miguel did not comment, but his fingers pressed harder on the pencil. "I don't want him to leave," Carmen said finally, not referring to the man in the tunic, but to the man at the table in the uniform whose nights had hollowed him out. "You don't have to," Eduardo said. The words felt foreign and necessary at once. He had no litmus for what would heal months of distance.
He only knew that staying would mean more than work. It would mean naming the things he had done wrong, the things he had withheld, and making different choices. They did not shout or hurl apologies. They sat awkwardly and small. And then, like two people learning to read, they said heart-shaped sentences that had been saved for better weather. "I'm sorry. I was scared. Forgive me." They made a promise that did not sound heroic, only human, that they would try again. The morning that followed was a patchwork of ordinary things that seemed remarkable after the night's rupture. Miguel asked his father to come to school for a project. Eduardo said yes. He meant it. The badge felt different that day. Not a shield he could hide behind, but a responsibility he had chosen with intention. At the station, the holding cell sat unremarkable and small. The man in the white tunic had been moved there, then to a bench, then to a chair. When Eduardo went back, caffeine thickening the blood in his chest, he found the cell empty. The cot was unrumpled. A wet trace on the floor ended in nothing. The last man on the overnight shift told him the same thing the cameras did. The footage showed the cruiser, the approach, then a blur where an individual had been. A 10-minute gap at one camera angle made the technicians frown. A street camera near the plaza had a blurred figure crossing at the very hour the man had been picked up. Later, neighbors would say they had seen a silhouette under the jacarandas, someone moving like a thread pulling through the fabric of the night. Captain Herrera was not a man easily moved by the uncanny. He ran the ledger like a steward runs a ship's log. But even he could not ignore the fact that civilians had started to come forward with similar stories. Doña Socorro's phone call had been the first, a tremulous confirmation that the event had not been private. Later that day, Father Miguel Herrera, the priest, not the captain, came by with a parish bulletin and a face that had been softened by more than sleep. "We received reports," he said, hands folded, looking like someone who carried his parish on his back like an old coat. "A man in white has been sitting with people on the plaza during the afternoons. He speaks, he listens, then he leaves." "They think he's Jesus," someone in the beat room muttered once, leaning over coffee, half joking and half afraid. The phrase passed through the room like cold air. Eduardo did not laugh. "It's better if we keep a record," Captain Herrera said, and the record grew. Testimonies, dates, times, photographs of small gestures, a chocolate bar on a stoop, a hand on a child's shoulder, a scrap of white fabric found under a park bench. None of it proved anything definitively. That was the point. The city, in its infinite appetite for explanation, wanted proof. The human heart wanted story. In the days that followed, the story threaded through the neighborhood like ivy. Some people mocked, others whispered. A boy named Diego, whose hair stuck up and whose sneakers were too small, told Doña Socorro and then a teacher that a man had sat with him in the plaza and given him a chocolate, then told him to go home and hug his sister. The boy's mother wept and called Eduardo. She said the child had never before been so obedient to caution, that his bravado had softened into something like fear turned toward care. Eduardo found himself drawn into the small economies of trust that started to rearrange the neighborhood. "Go with me," he told the school counselor one afternoon, and she raised an eyebrow but did not refuse. They found Diego at the edge of a group of boys at the park, eyes darting like a trapped bird. There was a gang on the corner, young men with a look Eduardo knew the ledger never captured, sudden focus, a hunger for belonging that fed on the same loneliness that had once kept him on patrol at impossible hours. The initiation was a ritual of dares and silence. Diego had been standing too close when the young men decided a shy kid would be toughened up. Eduardo did not storm in the way he used to in his early years, when force was the arrow that came fastest. He remembered the man in the tunic saying, "Choice is a door." He chose to speak. "Leave the kid alone," he said when he stepped into the circle. He did not shout, he did not brandish. Years of authority sat behind his tone, but something softer sat in his posture. The gang members looked at him like wolves startled by a new scent. One of them, a lanky boy with a name that slid across the station's files as El Flaco in an older life, stepped forward as if to challenge the intrusion. "You don't have to pick a fight," Eduardo said. He did not want to humiliate them or make heroes of himself. He wanted to open the sliver of a possibility. "What are you scared of?" They were. At the edges of bravado, you could always find an exposed pulse. Eduardo did not lecture. He listened. He offered an option 4 sentences and 2 clear actions long. "Come in for a chat at the community center Monday. No judgment, no record. And bring your sibling's name if you have one." The offer sounded unremarkable. It was not. It was the difference between assuming the worst and proposing something like hope. Diego's mother started to bring him to the community center in a week. El Flaco, who had been arrested twice as a teen and released under the complacency of the system, came too, initially because he wanted the snacks, but then because there were men there who had once been like him, and because someone had called him by name without a report attached. Eduardo's new approach caught on unevenly. Captain Herrera watched the numbers, the calls, the paperwork. "We're not social workers, Martinez," he said once, turning a reluctant ear toward the early results of the informal program. "But we are part of the city's veins. If you can get young people to stop starting the clock of trouble, that's on the record, too." "The note said live," Eduardo said quietly in response. "Maybe living starts with talking." A pilot program formed under Herrera's cautious blessing and the parish's reluctant enthusiasm. Father Miguel lent an office for the first week, and Doña Socorro promised to bring coffee. It was ordinary, a table, some chairs, an old poster about summer jobs, but the energy that occupied it was different. People showed up. They told stories that had been waiting for an audience. They vented, wept, named the names of those they had lost or feared. When men like El Flaco spoke of hunger and of the ways doors had been closed to them, someone else said, "Bring a resume, we'll help." It did not fix everything overnight. Recovery is not a quick ledger item. It began small, accrued in time. Roberto Morales, El Flaco's older brother by way of choice rather than blood, was the harder case. He had been in and out of the juvenile system, then vanished toward darker things. Eduardo had known him in passing for years, had seen him fold into acquaintances along the beat, but he had never before taken the time to draw him out. One afternoon, months into the program, Roberto Morales walked into the parish hall with a body of scars and a face that had surrendered too often. He came because his cousin told him someone from the police was offering job prep. He looked at Eduardo as if measuring a man who had been both enemy and rescuer. "You arrested me when I was 12, he said to Eduardo, sharp as a file. "You put me in a van with a blanket over me like I was nothing." Eduardo remembered. He had been younger then, brutal in ways duty had justified. He remembered the shaved heads, the metal cuffs, the way justice had felt like a ledger you could balance by removing people.
He felt the shame of younger mistakes like a bruise that had not healed. "I'm sorry," he said. It was not a legal apology. It was a human one, a confession that opened a seam. Roberto's face did not soften at first. It took time. It took the ledger of public apologies and private acts, a chance to work on a crew painting the parish fence, someone offering him a bus card, a mentor who taught him plumbing basics. Small dignities stacked. Roberto began to show up with a sense that his life mattered. He returned the favor of rescue by bringing other young men to meetings, telling them a story he had learned slow, that someone once offered him a table when he expected a sentence. Not all officers warmed to the new tone. Some rolled their eyes and told the new program to mind its metrics. Others watched quietly as numbers, calls for violence, gang-related assaults, nibbled down. The community did not become a miracle overnight. Fathers still grieved. Small businesses still boarded windows on certain nights. But where previously fear had been the dominant engine, presence started to compete with it. A cop at a soccer game, a neighbor who would sit and listen, a mentor who would pass along an application. Small dignities stacked. Roberto began to show up with a sense that his life mattered. He returned the favor of rescue by bringing other young men to meetings, telling them a story he had learned slow, that someone once offered him a table when he expected a sentence. Word traveled beyond the neighborhood. A reporter with a local paper wrote a piece that asked the question many asked in private. Had a Jesus-like figure passed through their streets, or had something else, a cascade of small human acts, triggered a new pattern? The headline leaned toward mystery, and the town leaned toward story. People came to the parish not only for Mass, but for testimony hours, where individuals told in trembling voices about small moments of grace. The grocery vendor who found the courage to keep an unsold loaf at the end of the day for a homeless man. The teenager who did not join a gang that evening because a man in a white tunic had sat with him on the plaza and said, "Go home to your sister." Father Miguel arranged a small meeting with Eduardo after one such testimony night. The priest, with his hair silver at the temples and his hands that smelled faintly of incense and coffee, spoke gently. "People are looking for anchors," he said. "When something breaks the order, they want something to hold. Your city needs more of the tenderness the man showed. Whether he was of God or only courage, we should not waste the moment. Compassion is practical." "Some will say he was Jesus," Eduardo said, rubbing his thumb along the edge of the note he kept folded in a drawer in his house. He had read the words until they had become as familiar as a prayer. "Many will say many things," Father Miguel answered. "I will tell them what I have seen. Men change their course. When the course changes, miracles or no, life is different. That may be the shocking truth." There was one story that resisted the tidy catalogs of evidence and yet moved people to the center of their simplest selves. A widow who had kept a list of names carved into the wood of her pantry, names of sons and brothers lost to the roads and to the silence of neglect, came forward and put a hand on Roberto's shoulder during a testimony night. She kissed his forehead in public and said, "You came back." Something like forgiveness passed between them, small as a coin and loud as a bell. There were skeptics. Psychiatrists wrote columns raising the possibility of mass suggestion, the human brain's appetite for narrative shaping fragile perceptions. Scientists noted the cover-of-night suggestion of pareidolia, that people see in the dark what they want to see. The police department's records showed no definitive proof that a man claiming divinity had been detained. There were reasoned theories: fatigue, group psychology, an enterprising storyteller. The program's detractors called it a gamble that distracted from more conventional interventions. Eduardo heard them and did not ignore their caution. He had once been an officer who trusted only the ledger. He now realized the ledger was necessary but not exhaustive. Still, small, tangible things linked themselves to the nights after the arrest. A photograph of a chocolate bar left beside a park bench, witnessed by two teenagers.
A security camera grain that showed a white fabric moving across a plaza where a child later said she had felt lighter. The parole numbers for a small cohort of young men who had enrolled in the parish program and kept their appointments. Father Miguel collected testimonies in a binder he kept in the sacristy for people to read. Doña Socorro left a rosary by the parish door one morning and whispered that the man had told her to pray for brave mothers. Months passed. The pilot program gained funding because numbers, however stubborn, began to nod toward improvement. Captain Herrera supported a larger initiative on the basis that community trust, while ineffable, corresponded to fewer violent calls and fewer nights of sirens. Eduardo was offered a promotion, not as a reward for a miracle, but as recognition for effectiveness, lead of a new community outreach team. He accepted with a hesitance that steadied into resolve. At the inauguration of the pilot program, under the bloom of jacaranda trees that dusted the air with lavender, the neighborhood gathered. There was a small stage, folding chairs, and a microphone that turned ordinary voices into proclamations. Father Miguel stood to speak, and the crowd fell quiet. He did not claim miraculous visitation as an article of faith. Instead, he said this: "We were touched by an event that made us remember how fragile we all are. We must respond with action. Mercy without work can wilt like a flower left on a windowsill. Mercy with hands becomes habit." Doña Socorro testified, hands shaken, that a child had come to her and said the man in white had told him, "You are brave." A woman in the front row held up a small packet, 2 pieces of chocolate wrapped in paper, saying she had found them on her stoop the week after. Diego, now calmer and clearer, stood with his mother and waved awkwardly to the crowd. Roberto Morales took the mic and said with surprising tenderness, "I thought my life was a closed story. People gave me pages." The applause was not thunderous, but it was warm, the kind that presses flesh and remembers the simplest truth: people can change. Later, during the ceremony, Captain Herrera stepped aside and told Eduardo, almost tenderly, "Don't make a spectacle of what's private, but keep doing the work." The captain's hand on Eduardo's shoulder had the firmness of a man who had learned to trust results over rhetoric. "Numbers are not everything," he added, "but they're enough to keep this alive." On the same day, an older neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, approached Eduardo with a small piece of paper. It was an index card with a single sentence written in a familiar slant of ink: "See with the eyes of the heart." She told him she had found the card in her mailbox 2 weeks after the arrest. Eduardo's palms went slick. He had kept the note he'd been given safe, but here was another echo in someone else's hand, as if the memory of the words had migrated into the world like a seed on the wind. The world continued. There were days of doubt, of old habits threatening to reassert themselves. Eduardo sometimes woke at 3:17 and felt his breath hitch. Sometimes he found his hand on the nightstand, fingers closing around the pistol, the old talisman of certainty, only to ease when he remembered the man's quiet insistence that guilt need not be identity. He began to attend meetings with a therapist offered through the precinct, not because he needed a miracle, but because he wanted to learn to carry his life differently. He learned, slowly, to speak Roberto's name without it becoming a wound that reopened at every mention. One afternoon, months after the arrest, Eduardo drove the job site where Roberto Morales was learning plumbing basics. The young man was bent over a pipe, a stubborn frown of concentration on his face. He looked up and smiled a little, the kind of smile that had to work its way outward slowly. Eduardo stayed a while, drank bitter coffee from a thermos, and watched men become useful to themselves. They joked about the police and the parish and the things that used to split community from authority. They were not saints. They were patched and human. There were quieter confirmations that nudged at the edges of the narrative. Father Miguel reported similar encounters in other parishes. An older woman who said a stranger in white had sat beside her while she counted pills and told her she was forgiven and loved. A homeless man who said a voice told him to go to the shelter and that someone would be waiting there with a blanket.
The stories multiplied in the manner of seeds thrown by the wind. In their accumulation, they altered the town's weather. Yet the deeper proof for Eduardo was not in testimonies or bulletins. It was in the small domestic things where grace is most easily measured. He began bringing Miguel to soccer games, not as an afterthought, but as a ritual. He learned to stop answering calls on certain nights, and instead to be in the kitchen where homework lived with the smell of coffee. He apologized to friends he had grown distant from. He visited Roberto's mother, not as a badge-bearing official seeking absolution, but as a man offering a hand and a shared sorrow. She accepted his hand and said little. Her acceptance was not a thunderclap, but a full stop. When the station camera footage was finally reviewed by a civilian auditor called in at public request, there was no conclusive image of an exit that explained the man's disappearance. In one clip, an empty bench was visible where a person had seemed to have been. In another, where the camera had trouble with the rain and the night, the pixels obfuscated any certainty. The ledger accepted the official. No charges filed, subject released without incident.
But the human ledger, comprised of mouths, prayers, and the odd scrap of paper, kept another record. As the anniversary of Roberto's death approached, Eduardo found himself drawn to the cemetery more often. He would go with a bouquet, or sometimes with nothing, just to sit on the stone bench and breathe. The site of the grave was a small patch of green, a marker worn smooth by seasons. One late afternoon, the light leaning toward amber, his fingers raked the damp soil. He sat and spoke aloud, words tumbling simple and clumsy. "I failed you. I miss you. Forgive me." He did not expect an answer. He did not expect commentary from heaven, or even the comfort of a dramatic sign. He expected the slow, salvageable work of memory. But as he turned to leave, he noticed a small impression in the soft mud near the headstone, like the imprint of a sandal, shallow and clean in the earth, as if someone had stood there barefoot and then walked away. It was small, unmarred by the prints of shoes or the churn of dogs. The print faced the city, as if someone had paused to look at the place he had been carrying for years. Eduardo knelt. He did not interpret it at once. He thought perhaps it was a work of children playing, a neighbor's misstep, or the cunning of weather and chance. He ran his hand around the rim of the impression and found the soil still slightly tacky from the morning's rain. He closed his eyes, and the man's voice, the one who had sat in the chair months before, drifted back. "See with the eyes of the heart." He did not leave footprints of certainty in the dirt. He left instead with the knowledge that whether the impression was made by divine foot or the hand of a neighbor, the effect it had on him was real. His chest felt less like a cell and more like a place where something might grow. At the parish ceremony weeks later, under a jacaranda whose blossoms fell like a slow pink snowfall, Eduardo spoke briefly. He had rehearsed nothing. He only wanted to tell the truth that would fit in a single breath. "I arrested a man on the highway," he said, voice steady but soft. "Many of us suspect he was Jesus, or an angel, or a poet of mercy, or an exhausted man with perfect words. I don't have proofs to offer. I have only this: my life changed. I came home. I stayed for my son's game. I learned to say my partner's name without anger. We started programs that brought people together. People started to show up for one another. That is the truth I can stand by." The crowd murmured, not in agreement, but in the way people make room for what has been freely given. Father Miguel blessed the project and spoke of mercy as work. Doña Socorro clapped and cried at the same time. Roberto Morales held his hands in the air like a man who had rediscovered his own pulse. In the months that followed, the program grew a modest, stubborn life. Young men learned trades. Small referrals kept them from late nights that used to be full of other kinds of tests. The parish provided food for a table that became a center of recovery and companionship. There were nights, the kind the police logs still recorded, when violence flared and the sirens returned. A single encounter does not render a city perfect. But there were fewer nights when the only response available was the blunt instrument of force. There were more nights when someone opened a door and listened. 2 years after that night on the highway, a woman with a reporter's notebook came to Eduardo and asked him the question he had been asked 1,000 ways since the arrest. Was he Jesus? He looked at the question like one might look at a broken window and choose which piece of glass to lift up. Many people believe so, he said carefully. Some don't. What I can say is that when I looked at him in the fluorescent light, I felt seen. When I opened the paper and read what it told me to do, I acted differently. If that man, call him what you will, started a chain that arrested guilt, not people, then whatever name you give him won't change that. The reporter wrote the line down. The piece that followed framed the episode as an event that changed more than a man's interior life. It became a case study in community policing that mixed the language of sociology with the cadence of testimony. In the margins of the article, a reader scrawled, "See with the eyes of the heart," as if the phrase had become a small local proverb. People still asked for definitive answers, as if certainty were the currency that solved grief. There were evenings when Eduardo walked the beat and listened to older men argue about whether the city had glimpsed the sacred or merely its own longing. He had no appetite for convincing anyone. The arrest on the shoulder of the highway had not produced a manifesto, it had produced choices. On a humid evening in late spring, Eduardo took Miguel to the cemetery for a small ceremony. They stood at Roberto's grave together and laid down a spray of thin flowers that smelled faintly of lemon. Miguel, taller now, seemed older by proportion, more steady in the world. They did not say much. They let the wind move the jacaranda petals around them like a private benediction. Eduardo knelt and ran his fingers through the soil near the marker. The mud had dried into small bronzed cracks. For a moment, he saw again the impression he had found months ago. A faint line, indistinct now, as though time itself had moved sand over the memory. He thought of paperwork, of the ledger of duties that still had to be met. He thought of Captain Herrera rubbing his chin, of Doña Socorro calling her neighbors, of Father Miguel holding a candle. He put his hand on Miguel's shoulder. "See with the eyes of the heart," he said softly. Miguel nodded, as if he had been listening all along. The boy-turned-teen took a breath like someone stepping into water, and then spoke with the kind of clarity only young men possess when they step out from the instructions of adults. "Dad," he said, "if someone asked you later, would you tell them the truth about what happened, about what you felt?" Eduardo looked at him and thought of the nights he had carried 5 minutes like a stone. He thought of the man who had sat in the fluorescent light and handed him a scrap of paper. He thought of all the small things that had followed: a chocolate on a stoop, a parish hall filled with people, a young man learning to turn a wrench. "What I would tell them," he said, slow and sure, "is this. I arrested a man on the highway. The shocking thing wasn't that the man might have been Jesus. The shocking thing was that when someone came and offered mercy in a quiet way, it made us stop and do better. The arrest didn't lock a person up. It arrested the way we had been living, our habit of avoiding one another, our habit of carrying other people's grief as if it were our own shame. That is the truth I carry." They walked back toward the car under a sky the color of old coins. A breeze shook the jacaranda, and petals drifted around them like confetti. The neighborhood hummed with its ordinary noises: dogs, a far-off radio, a child laughing in a yard, noise that testified to life continuing. Back at home, Eduardo kept the note in a small box with other small things: a rosary bead Doña Socorro had given him, a photograph of Roberto laughing at a summer barbecue, a ticket stub to a soccer game Miguel had gone to. He did not treat the paper as a relic. He treated it as a reminder that someone had offered him a choice and that he had taken it. He never claimed to have captured God in a bottle or to have proof of angels. He also never pretended the arrest had been merely a hallucination. The community had too many corroborating threads for that neat dismissal. People had been changed in ways measurably good. Fewer late-night arrests in certain blocks. Fewer weapon-related calls from corners of the parish. Young men entering workshops and not shortages. Whether the catalyst was a man in a tunic or the town's collective readiness to be moved, the outcome was itself a kind of witness. Years later, strangers would still ask about the night he arrested Jesus. Eduardo would smile a little, not out of amusement, but out of the gratitude of someone who had been given an unearned second chance. He would tell them what he could honestly say, that the man in the white tunic had been a figure who invited him to place down what he had been carrying. He would tell them that the note had been simple and clear. He would tell them finally that the most shocking truth of all was not the identity of the stranger, but that mercy could be enacted in a way that arrested cycles of violence and indifference. There are nights when Eduardo still wakes at 3:17. He sometimes puts his hand to the top drawer and breathes. He sometimes prays in words he learned at his mother's knee, and sometimes sits in the kitchen and waits, only to be present. He has learned that the work of mercy is not cinematic or rare. It is frequent, mundane, and slow. It is the coffee offered to a worried neighbor, the time given to a boy who needs to be heard, the patience extended to a man who has not yet learned how to be steady. And on some afternoons, when the jacarandas bloom and the plaza fills with children, small things happen that the ledger cannot account for. A chocolate bar left at a bench, a note half hidden under an old park map saying, "See with the eyes of the heart." A stranger who listens until a person unburdens, then walks away without expectation. Those are the things that make people speak of miracles without needing to prove them. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope. Watch the next video to meet another person whose life was shaped by an unexpected kindness. When Jesus was arrested that night on the highway, many insisted on the question of identity. But the shock that lingered was not about a name. It was about what happened afterward. The arrest of guilt, the loosening of hardened hands, the small restitution of a community that had forgotten how to be neighbor. Whether that arrest was of the historical Jesus, an angel, a prophet, or a man with extraordinary compassion, the town's life altered in a way that required less of dogma and more of action. In the end, the true shock was not finding the sacred where they expected it, but discovering that mercy, when met by choice, can arrest the very things that imprison us.